We like to believe that a house is just a container. Wood, glass, sheetrock, a passive witness to the lives inside. We tell ourselves that walls cannot hold grudges, and that a hallway doesn't remember the sound of a scream. But sometimes, a structure seems to absorb the history of those who live within it. It memorizes the grief. It records the silence. And occasionally, when the pressure becomes too great, it invites the violence back. December 31st, 20 to 5, New Year's Eve. A day usually reserved for reflection, for making plans, for looking forward to a fresh calendar and a clean slate. On Deborah Court, in Pitt County, North Carolina, the morning routine began like any other. Coffee, the low hum of a television, the anticipation of a new year. But at 9:24 a.m., a call came into the sheriff's office that shattered the morning quiet. It was a call that deputies likely dreaded, not because of what was said, but because of where it came from. They knew this address, they knew this driveway, because 14 months earlier, they had been here for a tragedy of accident. Today, they were returning for a tragedy of intent. Greenville is a place of order. It is a community where neighbors know the cars parked in the driveways, where the rhythm of life is dictated by the seasons and the school year. Deborah Court is a cul-de-sac designed for privacy, for safety. But safety is an illusion when the danger is already inside the door. When the patrol cars turned onto the street that morning, the air was still cold. The holiday decorations were still up, masking the reality of what lay behind the windows. The dispatch code was people injured. A vague, clinical phrase that covers everything from a fall to a fatality. But the officers approaching the scene understood the context that a dispatch code cannot convey. This was a home that had already been broken. In October 2024, a child had died here. A gun had been found. A grandfather had been charged. Grief had settled into the foundation of the house like dry rot. The neighbors assumed the worst had already happened. They assumed the quota for sorrow on Deborah Court had been filled. They were wrong. There is a cruel irony in how we view victims and suspects. We like them to be different people. We want a clear line between the one who causes harm and the one who suffers it. But on this morning, that line was erased. The man de 73-year-old Penhu had stood accused 14 months prior. Then, he was the figure of authority whose negligence had led to a child's death. He was the one who had to explain why a gun was accessible. He was the one who bore the legal and moral weight of a life cut short. He was the survivor of that first tragedy. He would not survive the second. This changes how we must look at the crime scene. This wasn't just a break-in or a random act of violence. This was a collapse. The pressure that had been building since the death of the child didn't dissipate. It evolved. The discovery of the bodies was brutal. Blunt force touched sharp force. A chaotic, angry end to two lives that had spanned decades. Rayfield and Francis Ruffin were found in the home they had shared, beaten and stabbed. But the most disturbing detail wasn't in the room with them. It was outside. When detectives began to canvass the area, desperate for a lead on a fleeing intruder, they didn't find a stranger hiding in the woods. They didn't find a getaway car speeding toward the highway. They found a 34-year-old man walking calmly along the roadway nearby. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. He was the grandson, a resident of the home. A young man who had lived in the shadow of the house's history, walking away from the ruin he is accused of creating. We often ask why a crime happened. We look for a snap, a break, a sudden loss of control on a holiday morning. But what if the snap didn't happen on December 31st? What if the violence that destroyed Rayfield and Frances Ruffin wasn't an explosion, but an echo? To understand why a grandson would turn on the people who raised him, we cannot start with the murder. We have to go back to the moment the house first learned how to kill. To understand the end of Rayfield and Frances Ruffin, we must first look at the life they built. By all external accounts, they were the anchors of their family. At 73 and 67 years old, they represented stability. They were the generation that stays put. The generation that opens its doors to children and then to grandchildren. Family members would later describe them as beautiful people. It is a phrase we hear often in the wake of tragedy, a reflex to protect the memory of the dead. But in this case, the description paints a specific picture. A couple who had spent decades cultivating a home that was supposed to be a sanctuary. A place where the extended family could land when the world outside became too difficult. But sanctuary is fragile. It requires a sense of safety that, once broken, is almost impossible to repair. For the Ruffin household, that safety did not shatter on the morning of the double homicide. It had already been compromised 14 months earlier. October 2024. The air was different then. The leaves were turning. The neighborhood was quiet. Inside the house on Deborah Court, there were children playing. A 6-year-old, a 5-year-old. The sounds of a normal evening. And then, a sound that does not belong in a playroom. It was a single gunshot. A moment of confusion that severed the timeline of the family forever. In the chaos that followed, the reality became clear. A 6-year-old child had found a handgun. A weapon that had been left accessible. The 5-year-old sibling was struck. The rush to the hospital, the flashing lights, the frantic prayers, it all ended in the worst possible way. The child died, and in the silence that followed the funeral, the law stepped in. This is where the story of the house begins to twist. Rayfield Ruffin was the head of the household. He was the protector, but the gun belonged to him. The failure to secure it was laid at his feet. The law does not account for grief. It accounts for liability. And so, the great-grandfather, in the midst of mourning a child, was charged. Consider the atmosphere inside those walls in the months that followed. This was no longer just a home. It was a crime scene. It was a place where a child had died by accident, but an accident that carried the weight of blame. Rayfield was no longer just a patriarch. He was a defendant. The legal scrutiny would have been a constant, low-level hum in the background of their daily lives. Every room would have held a memory of that October night. Every interaction would have been colored by the legal process playing out in the background. Shame, guilt, The quiet strain of trying to maintain normalcy when the worst thing imaginable has already happened. And yet, they stayed. They continued to live there. They continued to host family. Among those living in the home was Martinez, Corvell Ruffin, 34 years old, the grandson. He was there while the family grieved. He was there while his grandfather navigated the legal consequences of the shooting. He was a witness to the slow, grinding pressure that comes after a public tragedy. We often assume that, after a catastrophe, a family bonds together. We assume that shared trauma creates a shield against future violence. We want to believe that, having survived one storm, the house had earned its calm. By December 2025, over a year had passed. The legal proceedings regarding the gun charge were a matter of record. The family was preparing to turn the page into 2026. New Year's Eve is a powerful psychological marker. It promises that the old year, with all its mistakes and sorrows, can be left behind. Rayfield and Francis likely believed they had weathered the worst of the storm. They had survived the loss of the child. They had survived the judgment of the community. They were still standing. They had no way of knowing that the final blow would not come from the court system, or from an intruder, or from the outside world at all. They did not know that the tension in the house had not dissipated. It had merely found a new vessel. As the sun rose on the last day of the year, the house on Deborah Court was quiet. But it was not peaceful. It was waiting. And the person who would break that silence was already in the room. December 31st is a day of ritual. It is the day we bargain with time. We look at the calendar and convince ourselves that the mistakes of the past 12 months can be closed like a ledger. We make promises to be better, to be happier, to be safer. For Rayfield and Francis Ruffin, the morning of New Year's Eve likely held that same quiet promise. They were in their 70s and 60s. They had navigated a year of profound difficulty. The desire to simply sit in a quiet room and breathe would have been strong. But the atmosphere inside the house on Deborah Court was not R.E. It was tightening. The details of what happened in the early hours of that morning are still locked away in case files. We do not know who woke up first. We do not know if there was an argument over coffee or a disagreement about the year ahead. But we know who was there with them. Martinez Corvell Ruffin, 34 years old. There is a specific tension that exists in intergenerational households that is rarely discussed. When an adult grandchild lives with grandparents, the dynamics are complex. There is love, certainly. But there is also the friction of three adults sharing a space designed for a nuclear family. There are questions of independence, of money out of the past. In most families, this friction results in quiet resentments or slammed doors. It does not result in bloodshed. And this is where the story becomes truly unsettling. In the aftermath of the crime, the community looked for the warning signs. We always do. We want to hear that there were shouting matches the night before. We want to hear that the police had been called to the home for domestic disturbances involving the grandson. We want a trail of breadcrumbs that explains the destination. But according to the public record, that trail is missing. There were no reports of Martinez spiraling. No documented history of violence that would predict a double homicide. He was simply there, a resident, a family member, a part of the household's daily rhythm. This absence of a warning is often more terrifying than a threat. It suggests that the capacity for extreme violence can exist without a signal. It suggests that a person can walk through a living room, day after day, appearing stable, while something catastrophic builds silently behind their eyes. Sometime before 9:24 a.m., that silence broke. The violence that erupted was not a momentary lapse. It was not a single, tragic mistake like the accidental shooting 14 months prior. It was sustained. Investigators would later find evidence of both blunt force trauma and stab wounds. These are not distant methods of killing. They require proximity. They require physical exertion. To attack, to people who raised you, who are elderly, who our family requires a level of detachment that is difficult to comprehend. It suggests that in those final moments, Martinez did not see Rayfield and Francis as his grandparents. He saw something else, an obstacle, a source of rage, or perhaps he saw nothing at all. The attack utilized multiple items, according to the sheriff. The randomness of the weapons suggests improvisation. It suggests an explosion of impulse rather than a calculated plot. It was a storm that rose up inside the house, destroyed everything in its path, and then, just as quickly, dissipated. At 9:24 a.m., the phone rang at the dispatch center. People injured. With those two words, the private nightmare of the Ruffin family became a matter of public record. The walls of the house could no longer contain the secret. The doors were about to be opened. And the scene waiting for the deputies was not just a crime scene. It was the end of a lineage. But as the sirens approached, the man responsible for the carnage did not flee into the shadows. He did something that defies the logic of a criminal mind. He went for a walk. When law enforcement arrives at a homicide scene, the immediate priority is not justice, it is containment. The officers rushing into the home on Deborah Court had to assume the threat was still active. They had to assume that whoever had brutalized Rayfield and Francis Ruffin was still in the house, weaponing waiting behind a door. They moved room to room, weapons drawn, adrenaline spiking. They found the victims. They confirmed the deaths. But they found something else, too, an empty house. The violence had already left the building. The investigation immediately pivoted outward. The perimeter was established. The radius expanded. In a typical home invasion or burglary gone wrong, the suspect is long gone speeding away in a vehicle, putting miles between themselves and the consequences. But this was not a typical crime. A short time later, deputies canvassing the nearby roads spotted a figure. A man walking alone. It is an image that feels cinematic in its eeriness. Martinez Corvell Ruffin was not sprinting through the woods. He was not trying to hotwire a car. He was simply walking along the roadway, not far from the house where his grandparents lay dead. There is a profound psychological dissonance in this behavior. Flight is a primal instinct. When a human being commits an act of extreme violence, the brain usually screams one command: run. Adrenaline demands movement, fear demands distance. But Martinez did not run. When deputies approached him, the interaction was likely tense, but swift. They stopped him, they detained him, and then the pieces began to click into place. He was not a stranger, he was the grandson. He lived at the address. And then, the physical evidence. Sheriff Paula Dance would later confirm that a knife was recovered from his person. A weapon carried out of the house and onto the public street. The arrest was made. The handcuffs were applied. In that moment, the narrative of the morning shifted instantly. This was no longer a mystery of who. The who was standing right there, calm and captured. The mystery had now become entirely about why. As they placed him in the patrol car, the reality of the situation began to settle over the neighborhood. The man who had grown up in that house, who had slept under its roof, who had eaten at its table, was now being driven away from it for the last time. He was charged with 2 open counts of murder, 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill. The language of the law is precise, but it feels inadequate to describe the betrayal involved. The deputies, driving him to the detention center, likely looked in the rearview mirror, wondering what was happening behind those eyes. Was there regret? Was there shock? Or was there simply the blank stare of a mind that had disconnected from reality? Back at the house, the crime scene tape was going up. The neighbors were gathering, and the investigators were left with the grim task of working backward. From the bodies to the motive. They had the weapon, they had the suspect. But, as they would soon discover, having the answers only made the questions more painful. The arrest of Martinez Ruffin provided a face for the tragedy, but it provided no relief. In fact, for the extended Ruffin family, the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, a new kind of nightmare began. In a standard homicide, the family of the victim and the family of the suspect are on opposite sides of the courtroom. There is a clear division versus them, the grieving versus the accused. But in a case of parricide, when a child or grandchild kills their elders, there is no division. The family of the victim is the family of the suspect. The relatives who gathered to mourn Rayfield and Francis had to simultaneously process the fact that the person who killed them was one of their own. To seek justice for the grandparents means seeking punishment for the grandson. There is no clean way to grieve. Every tear shed for the victims is complicated by the blood shared with the killer. Martinez was booked into the Pitt County Detention Center. He was held without bond. The charges were open counts of murder. In the North Carolina legal system, this is a procedural holding pattern. It allows the state to keep the defendant in custody while they determine the degree of the crime. It buys time for the evidence to be processed, for the autopsies to be completed, for the full picture to form. But for the public, the picture was already terrifyingly clear. Sheriff Paula Dance, the voice of authority in a county that had seen too much tragedy, had to stand before the cameras again. She had to confirm the names. She had to confirm the relationship. She had to explain to a weary community that the house on Deborah Court, the same house they remembered from the news 14 months ago, was once again a crime scene. The investigation quickly moved from the what to the how. The sheriff's office revealed that while a knife was found on Martinez, several potential items or weapons may have been used. This detail is clinical, but horrific. It implies a prolonged struggle. It implies that when one weapon failed or was discarded, another was found. It suggests a relentless determination to end life. And yet, despite this ferocity, the motive remained a void. There were no press conferences announcing a drug debt, no revelations of a disputed inheritance, no talk of a sudden psychotic break diagnosed by state psychiatrists. Just the silence of the investigation. This silence feeds the unease. We want a reason. We want to be told that Martinez was evil, or sick, or desperate. We want a category to put him in so we can feel safe. But the law doesn't need a motive to convict. It only needs evidence. And as Martinez sat in his cell, the evidence against him was mounting. The blood, the knife, the proximity. The legal machine began its slow grind. Hearings would be set, defense attorneys appointed. The state would build its case. But outside the courtroom, the real questions were rippling through the community. How does a family survive this? How do you bury two grandparents and visit their killer in jail? And perhaps most haunting of all, was there a sign everyone missed? In the gap between the child's death in 2024 and the grandparents' murder in 2025, something had festered in that house. A poison had been growing, invisible to the neighbors, invisible to the law, perhaps even invisible to Rayfield and Francis themselves, until it was too late. The caution tape eventually comes down. The patrol cars leave. The media trucks pack up and move to the next tragedy, but the house remains. On Deborah Court, the residence stands as a physical monument to a family's collapse. It is a structure that has now witnessed the loss of a young soul and the sudden departure of two elderly caretakers. It is a place where 3 generations of the same bloodline have met, heartbreaking ends in less than 500 days. For the neighbors, walking past that driveway must feel like walking past a memorial ground. The mundane objects of suburban life, the mailbox, the porch light, the front lawn are now charged with a heavy, somber energy. It forces us to ask, what happens to a place like this? Does a family move back in? Do they try to scrub the floors and repaint the walls and pretend that the history isn't there? Or does the house sit empty, a hollow shell waiting for a new owner who doesn't know the stories? The tragedy of the Ruffin family is not just about the loss of life. It is about the loss of sanctuary. Rayfield and Francis Ruffin spent their final years dealing with the aftermath of an accident. They tried to hold their family together. They tried to navigate the legal system. They tried to be the pillars they were always known to be. They succeeded in surviving the first wave of grief, but they could not see the second wave coming. The grandson they housed, the boy they likely helped raise, became the instrument of their downfall. It is the ultimate betrayal of the social contract. We trust our family to protect us. We trust our homes to shelter us. On December 31st, 2025, both of those trusts were broken. As the legal case against Martinez moves forward, there will be examinations and hearings. There will be discussions of capacity and intent. The state will seek justice. But justice is a legal concept, not a restorative one. A verdict cannot unring the bell. It cannot bring Rayfield and Francis back to their morning coffee. It cannot erase the image of a grandson walking down the road with a concealed object in his pocket. The story of the Deborah Court case is a reminder that we never truly know what is happening behind closed doors. We see the brick and the mortar. We see the holiday wreaths. We see the quiet cul-de-sacs. But we do not see the pressure. We do not see the cracks forming in the foundation until the house brings itself down. In the end, we are left with a timeline that feels incomplete. October 2024, a child passes away. December 2025, two grandparents are lost. Between those two dates lies a year of silence. A year of unseen interactions, unspoken resentments, and unrecorded grief. The courts will try to fill in the blanks. They will produce transcripts and evidence logs. They will try to tell us why Martinez Corvell Ruffin did what he did. But some questions are not meant for a courtroom. They linger in the quiet spaces of our own homes. We look at our own families. We look at the people we live with, the people we trust. And we wonder how much pressure a single house can hold before it breaks. Rayfield and Francis Ruffin believed they were safe. They believed the worst was behind them. They were wrong. And as night falls on Deborah Court, the house stands dark. A silent witness to the fact that sometimes the threat isn't waiting outside. Sometimes it has a key to the front door at good night.